Case file number 008. Classification: Historical and psychological phenomenon. Subject: vampire belief, death anxiety, and the fear of the unnatural dead. There are a few creatures in human history more persistent than the vampire. Not because it exists, but because the fear behind it never truly disappeared. For centuries, people across Europe believed the dead could return. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, but physically. Bodies were exhumed, examined, staked, burned. Entire communities became convinced that death itself had failed. And unlike many legends from the ancient world, these accounts were documented, recorded by priests, military officials, physicians, government authorities. The vampire was not originally a literary monster. It was a social explanation, a way to interpret disease, decay, contagion, and grief, and the terrifying possibility that the dead were not staying dead. Tonight, we examine the emergence of vampire belief in Europe, the historical cases that fueled panic, and the psychological mechanisms that reinforced it, and the deeper fear beneath all of it. Because beneath the mythology, beneath the folklore, beneath the superstition was something much more human. The fear that death was not final. Long before the word vampire entered popular culture, human beings feared the dead. Nearly every civilization in history developed burial rituals, protective rites, ceremonial practices, not simply to honor the dead, but to contain them. The boundary between life and death was viewed as fragile. During the medieval period, that fear intensified, especially in Europe, because medieval life was saturated with death. As we discussed last week, there were disease outbreaks, famine, infant mortality, war, public execution, bodies scattered everywhere. Death was not distant. It was visible and, critically, poorly understood. The biological process of decomposition was largely unknown. Most people never studied the body scientifically. They observed it and interpreted what they saw through religion, tradition, and fear. Within Christian Europe, death carried enormous theological importance. The dead were expected to remain at rest until resurrection. Bodies returning prematurely or appearing active after death violated divine order. And once that possibility entered collective belief, fear escalated rapidly. The Black Death intensified these anxieties dramatically. The 14th century plague pandemic killed millions. Entire villages disappeared. Mass graves became common. Families watch loved ones die in succession, often without explanation. And psychologically, when human beings encounter widespread death without clear causation, they search for agency. Something responsible, something active, something intentional. And this is something we have seen repeatedly throughout the duration of this podcast. At this time, this tendency would eventually become central to vampire belief, because unexplained death rarely remained unexplained for long. Communities created narratives, and those narratives created monsters. One of the most disturbing aspects of historical vampire belief is that many observations made by witnesses were real. The interpretation was flawed, but the observations themselves were often accurate. And this is what made vampire panic so convincing. Villagers exhumed bodies expecting decay, but instead, they sometimes encountered something else. Bodies appearing swollen, blood visible around the mouth, skin still intact, minimal decomposition, hair and nails seemingly longer. To modern audiences, these are explainable post-mortem processes. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, they appeared supernatural. After death, decomposition creates gases within the body. These gases cause bloating. Villagers interpreted this swelling as evidence the corpse had recently fed. Blood or dark fluid emerging from the mouth was another critical detail. In reality, this purge fluid results from internal breakdown, but observers believe the corpse had consumed blood. Hair and nails did not actually continue growing. The surrounding skin retracted during decomposition, creating the illusion of growth. And cold climates often slowed decay dramatically. Bodies buried during winter could remain preserved for extended periods. To terrified communities, this did not appear natural. It appeared active, and psychologically, this is important. Because fear intensifies when observable evidence appears to confirm belief. The corpse becomes proof, not because the conclusion is correct, but because the visual evidence appears emotionally convincing. This created a feedback loop. Fear influenced interpretation. Interpretation reinforced fear. And eventually, entire communities accepted the same explanation. The dead were returning. The modern image of the vampire largely emerged from Eastern Europe, particularly regions within modern Serbia, Hungary, Romania, and the Balkans. These areas experienced repeated conflict, disease outbreaks, political instability, and deep rural isolation. Folk traditions surrounding the restless dead already existed. But during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, something changed. The reports became more systematic and more detailed, and critically, officially documented. The vampire transformed from folklore into an investigated phenomenon. The term itself varied by region. Vampire, upir, upire. But the structure remained consistent. A deceased individual was blamed for illness or death within the community. Victims reported nighttime visitations, weakness, pressure on the chest, decline, and then eventually, death. The suspected vampire was exhumed. The body was examined. And if signs interpreted as unnatural preservation were present, the corpse was destroyed, usually through staking, decapitation, burning, or even all three. These were not isolated rituals. They became structured responses. And once authorities began documenting them, the panic expanded. One of the first major officially documented vampire cases occurs in 1725 in the Serbian village of Kisilova. The accused, Peter Blagojevic. According to reports, Blagojevic died naturally, but shortly after his burial, villagers began reporting disturbing experiences. Several individuals claimed the deceased man visited them during the night. Some reported pressure on the body. Others claimed he attempted to strangle them. And within days, multiple villagers died. The deaths appeared connected, and once the idea emerged that Blagojevic was responsible, fear spread rapidly. An Austrian official named Frombold was sent to document the event. His report still survives today. And this is what makes the case historically significant. The investigation was not treated as fantasy. It was treated as an administrative matter. The body was exhumed. Witnesses described minimal decomposition. The skin even appeared fresh. Hair and nails appeared intact, and blood was reportedly visible around the mouth. To modern science, these are explainable post-mortem conditions, but to villagers, this was confirmation. The body was staked. According to witnesses, blood emerged from the corpse after penetration. This intensified belief further. The body was ultimately burned, and the panic subsided. Psychologically, this case demonstrates how communities construct certainty during crisis. The deaths required explanation. The corpse provided visible evidence. And once fear became collective, alternative interpretations disappeared. If the case of Peter Blagojevic introduced the idea of the vampire into official European documentation, the case of Arnold Pohl transformed it into an international panic. Because unlike earlier rumors, this case expanded, repeated, escalated, and perhaps most importantly, it involved witnesses who believed they were observing evidence directly. Arnold Pohl was reportedly a Serbian Hajduk, a soldier and laborer living near the village of Medveda during the early 18th century. According to local accounts, Pohl claimed something deeply disturbing before his death. He believed he had once encountered a vampire himself. Now, stories vary slightly depending on the source, but according to village testimony, Pohl stated that while serving in territories affected by vampire panic, he was attacked by one of the undead. And within local belief systems, this mattered enormously, because vampire attacks were not always viewed as isolated events. They were contagious. A victim could become the next source of infection after death. And according to tradition, Pohl attempted to protect himself. He reportedly consumed soil from the grave of the vampire believed to have attacked him and smeared himself with the creature's blood. To modern audiences, this sounds bizarre, but psychologically it reflects something very human. Ritualized attempts to regain control during uncertainty. If contamination is feared, people create counter-rituals, protective acts, symbolic defenses. And throughout history, human beings consistently performed rituals when facing invisible threats they did not understand. Not long afterward, Arnold Pohl died. Most reports claim he suffered a fatal fall while working with hay or farming equipment. At first, nothing unusual occurs. He is buried normally, and life continues within the community. But within weeks, the reports begin. Villagers claim they are seeing Pohl at night. Some describe him appearing near homes. Others claim pressure on the chest while sleeping. And several individuals begin growing ill. Weakness, fatigue, rapid decline, then eventually, death. At this point, fear spreads rapidly through the community because the pattern appears familiar, especially in regions already influenced by earlier vampire stories. The dead man returns, people weaken, and more people die. The conclusion begins forming before evidence is ever examined. And psychologically, this is critical because once a community accepts a narrative framework, new information begins filtering through it automatically. Ambiguous experiences suddenly become confirmation. Nightmares become visitations. Illness becomes attack, and coincidence becomes a pattern. Eventually, villagers demand exhumation. Authorities comply, and this is where the case becomes historically extraordinary, because unlike many earlier folklore accounts, the Arnold Pohl investigation was formally documented, not by storytellers or wandering monks, but by military officials and physicians operating under Austrian administration. The Habsburg Empire had recently expanded influence into Serbian territories, which meant regional authorities were now expected to investigate unusual disturbances, including reports of vampire activity. And remarkably, they did. When Pohl's body was exhumed, witnesses described what they believed were unmistakable signs of vampirism. According to reports, the corpse showed limited decomposition. The skin appeared unusually preserved. Fresh blood was allegedly visible near the mouth, and new fingernails and hair appeared present. Now, to modern forensic science, these observations are explainable, as we previously discussed. Decomposition often creates bloating, fluid purge, skin retraction, and delayed decay in colder environments. But to 18th century villagers, this was horrifying, because the body did not appear properly dead. And once the corpse itself becomes emotionally convincing, fear intensifies dramatically. The visual experience reinforces the belief system, and the body becomes evidence. The villagers respond according to local tradition. A stake is driven through Arnold Pohl's body. Witnesses reportedly describe blood emerging from the corpse during the act. Some accounts even claim audible sounds escaped the body. To terrified observers, this confirmed everything. But scientifically, post-mortem gases and fluid pressure can produce these effects naturally. The body was then burned. And for a brief moment, the community believed the threat had ended. But it had not. Over the following years, additional deaths occur in the region, and once again, villagers begin suspecting vampirism. This is where the panic expands beyond a single corpse, because now, multiple individuals are accused posthumously. Entire households become associated with contamination, and eventually, a large-scale investigation is launched. In 1731 and 1732, Austrian military physicians examined numerous bodies connected to alleged vampire attacks. Among them was a military surgeon, Johannes Flukinger. Their findings would later be compiled into one of the most famous documents in vampire history, the Vicium et Repertum. The report is chilling to read today, not because it proves vampires existed, but because it demonstrates how seriously the phenomenon was treated. Bodies are described clinically, exhumations documented methodically, physical observations recorded in detail. And nowhere does the report dismiss the fear entirely. Instead, the investigations operate from the assumption that something dangerous may genuinely be occurring. And psychologically, this matters enormously, because authority validates belief. When governments investigate a phenomenon seriously, communities interpret the investigation itself as confirmation. Fear becomes institutionalized, no longer rumor, no longer folklore, but a recognized threat. The Arnold Pole case spreads throughout Europe. Newspapers discuss it. Scholars debate it. Religious authorities address it. And the word vampire begins entering broader European consciousness. This moment is critical historically because the vampire transitions from isolated rural superstition into a recognized cultural phenomenon. One discussed not only by peasants but by educated society. And once elite institutions engage with the belief, its influence expands dramatically. But beneath the folklore, beneath the exhumations, beneath the panic, the deeper psychological mechanisms remain visible. The community was experiencing unexplained death. Disease spread through households. Bodies behaved in unfamiliar ways after burial. And human beings needed explanation. Not eventually, but immediately. Because uncertainty is psychologically intolerable during a crisis, especially when death spreads without a visible cause. The vampire provided structure, a source, a target, something identifiable, and most importantly, something that could be fought, because disease is invisible. Grief is controllable. But a vampire can be dug up, staked, burnt, destroyed. The rituals restored a sense of agency, even if the explanation itself was false. And perhaps that is what makes the Arnold Pole case so disturbing. Not simply the fear itself, but how understandable that fear becomes once viewed through the world they inhabited. One of the strongest modern explanations for vampire belief involves disease, particularly illnesses poorly understood during the early modern period. Tuberculosis may be the most important. Known historically as consumption, the disease slowly weakened victims. Symptoms included pale appearance, weight loss, fatigue, bloody coughing, and gradual death. Families often died sequentially, one member after another. To grieving communities, it appeared the deceased relative was draining life from surviving family members. This interpretation directly influenced vampire accusations, especially in rural communities. Rabies may also have contributed. Symptoms included aggression, sensitivity to light, biting, insomnia, and erratic behavior. Some historians argue outbreaks of rabies influence vampire characteristics, particularly violent feeding behavior. There are also theories involving porphyria, a rare blood disorder associated with light sensitivity, though historians strongly debate this connection. Importantly, these diseases were terrifying not simply because they killed people, but because they spread. And psychologically, Human beings often personify contagion. We search for a source, a cause we can identify. The vampire fulfilled that role, and it transformed invisible disease into visible intention. Within Christian Europe, vampire belief intersected deeply with theology. The dead were expected to remain in the grave until resurrection. Bodies violating that order represented spiritual corruption, and proper burial became associated with danger. Individuals denied proper rites were feared. Suicides, criminals, the excommunicated, people who were viewed as morally unstable during life. Communities believed evil could influence the corpse or prevent the soul from resting. This is important psychologically because religious frameworks provided meaning during uncertainty. The vampire was not simply a biological fear. It was moral fear, spiritual contamination, a corruption of divine structure, and this made the phenomenon far more emotionally powerful because it combined fear of death with fear of judgment. Although not technically a vampire case, Elizabeth Bathory became strongly associated with later vampire mythology. A Hungarian noblewoman accused of murdering young women during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Stories later emerged claiming she bathed in blood to preserve youth. Historians debate many aspects of this case. Some argue political motives influenced accusations. Others believe genuine violence occurred. But culturally, Bathory contributed to the evolving image of blood consumption, immortality, and aristocratic monstrosity, which later became central to literary vampires, particularly during the 19th century. Vampire belief did not remain confined to Eastern Europe. By the 19th century, similar patterns appeared in the United States, particularly in New England. One of the most famous cases involves Mercy Brown. In Rhode Island during 1892, multiple members of the Brown family died from tuberculosis. As surviving relatives weakened, fear intensified. The deceased were blamed. Mercy Brown's body was exhumed. Cold weather had slowed decomposition. Her organs appeared unusually preserved. This was interpreted as proof of vampirism. Her heart was then removed and burned. Her ashes were reportedly mixed into medicine for surviving family members. The practice failed medically, but psychologically, it restored a sense of control. And that is the key. Vampire rituals often functioned psychologically as attempts to reclaim agency during uncontrollable loss. By the 19th century, vampire belief increasingly shifted from folklore into literature. Writers transformed rural panic into Gothic horror. The vampire evolved further. No longer a bloated corpse blamed for disease, but an intelligent aristocratic predator. In 1897, everything changes with the publication of Dracula. Irish author Bram Stoker did not invent the vampire, but he reshaped it permanently. Stoker drew from Eastern European folklore, where he encountered references to a historical figure, Vlad III Dracula. Often remembered as Vlad the Impaler, a ruler of Wallachia during the 15th century, known historically for extreme brutality, particularly execution through impalement. Thousands were reportedly displayed publicly during military conflicts, bodies left exposed as warnings, as demonstrations of power, and over time, his reputation became legendary. The name Dracula itself derives from his father's association with the Order of the Dragon, with Dracula loosely interpreted as son of the dragon, or in later interpretations, son of the devil. Modern culture often portrays Vlad as the direct historical origin of the vampire, but historically, the connection appears more limited. Most scholars believe Stoker borrowed primarily the name and perhaps the atmosphere of brutality surrounding the figure, not the full historical biography. But psychologically, the association matters because it demonstrates real violence, real fear, and how historical trauma can merge with folklore over time, until eventually, history itself becomes monstrous. Across centuries, vampire belief evolved dramatically, but its psychological foundation remained remarkably consistent. Unexplained death, fear, pattern recognition, social reinforcement, action. The vampire was not created by fiction, it was created by grief, disease, misunderstood biology, religious fear, and humanity's desperate need to explain suffering. The corpse became evidence. The ritual became control. And once entire communities accepted the same explanation, belief stabilized, even without proof. And perhaps this is what makes the historical vampire so unsettling. Not the creature itself, but the realization that intelligent people genuinely believed it existed. Not because they were foolish, but because fear changes perception, especially when death feels close and unexplained. The vampire survives because the fear behind it survives. The fear of death, of contamination, of unfinished burial, of something returning that should remain gone. And throughout history, when human beings could not explain suffering, they created explanations powerful enough to survive for centuries. Sometimes they became folklore, and sometimes they became the monsters among us. I'll see you next week. If you enjoyed this episode of the Cryptic Mind podcast, please like, comment, subscribe, and follow wherever you are listening.